Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything here on SIFTD Games at SIFTD.net. I'm Shane Satterfield, your host for Ask Shane Anything, where you can literally ask me just about anything as long as it's not crazy personal. Now, I will say this is the first time in over 120 episodes that we did not have enough questions to create a full episode. So today's episode is going to be shorter than normal, and get those questions in. We can't do this show without your questions. Scrolling through the forum thread where you guys ask questions, there are so many of you guys that used to ask great questions every week who haven't asked a question in months and months. So get off the sideline, go to SIFTD.net, click the link in the header there, ask me some questions. That way I can be back next week to do another episode. Question number one comes from someone I never have to ask questions, and that, of course, is Kevin. What are your thoughts on the current generation of consoles? Has it met your expectations? All right, I'm going to start this by just saying no. No. This generation of consoles has not met my expectations at all. And part of it is the law of diminishing returns, which, as the years go on, becomes more prevalent with hardware development. You end up spending a lot more money for getting minimal gains. We saw this week, I think it was at Gamescom Asia, Sean Layden, formerly of PlayStation, talked about this. He basically said that, the console wars are over as far as the tech wars, that no matter how much money PlayStation and Xbox spend going forward, basically the consoles are going to be equal, and that you need to start winning on content instead of technology. And I take all that into account. Obviously, I've been in this industry for a long time. I've seen the leaps from one console generation to another get smaller and smaller until they're almost imperceptible. In this last generation, I feel like was the least perceptible, particularly if you did get one of the mid-generation refreshes like the Xbox One X. If you got those and kind of had that checkerboarding 4K, then the upgrade to PS5 and Xbox Series X has not been all that drastic. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that third-party games continued to be released for last gen and this gen for almost 4 years. I mean, we're still getting last-gen versions of games right now. Granted, those are generally like the annual games like Madden and NBA 2K and things like that. But still, we are still getting last-gen versions of some big third-party games. And that normally would have weaned off by year 2 and definitely by year 3 in prior console generations. So hardware-wise, technology-wise, I am disappointed in this generation. Like, it's ridiculous that we still don't have all that many PlayStation 5 exclusives from Sony that write to the metal of the PlayStation 5 and are only for PlayStation 5. We still don't have that many. And already PlayStation has given us a PS5 Pro. That tells you all you need to know. Xbox Series X, I mean, most of the problems with that platform have been a lack of first-party output. Same problem Xbox has had for the last, 12, 13 years at this point. It is getting better, and it's going to get a lot better here in the next couple years, but truth be told, here we are 3 or 4 years into this generation, and still, it's been a smattering of releases for Xbox Series X. So yes, I've been disappointed in both Xbox and PlayStation from first-party perspectives. I've also been disappointed in third parties because they are refusing to move, or refuse for a really long time, to move into the new generation and start making games just for PS5 and Xbox Series X. And honestly, I think that has held the entire industry back because you're not seeing games that are blowing your mind graphically. And I hate to say it, but you look at casuals, that's a big deal for them. That is generally when they buy consoles. When they see a game that they're like, wow, that definitely won't work on my PS4. We aren't getting enough of those. It's not convincing people to upgrade. We've seen that big time on Xbox and to a lesser extent on PlayStation 5, which at least is in the same class as PlayStation 4 where sales are concerned. Sales of PS5 have also cooled down. Do I think it'll hit PS4's numbers eventually? Maybe if it lasts for 10 years, but otherwise I don't think it will. So, have I been disappointed in the hardware? Yes. Have I been disappointed in the games? Yes. Really? Indie games are what is moving the industry at this point. Big budget games are so far and few between that you need all these really small games to fill in all the cracks and the gaps. And again, I don't have a problem with that for the most part. I would prefer to play big budget games if I have the choice, but I do also love indie games. But the casual player does not. I think this is a big issue with Game Pass that Microsoft never anticipated. It's if you go to Game Pass and you look, it's I don't know, 30, and anecdotally, just off the top of my head, it looks like it's 30 to 40% big games, and the other 60 to 65% are small indie games that people have never heard of. I don't care how much you like indie games or how delusional you are about the industry or whatever. Casual people don't care about indie games. They don't, and they probably never will. So I am very disappointed, actually, at this generation. I'm disappointed in the first-party output of both Xbox and PlayStation, although Xbox is starting to get better. All those acquisitions are finally starting to pay off a little bit here. But PlayStation isn't. We're still stuck with maybe one or two big PlayStation first-party games a year, if we're lucky. And in some of those cases, they're not even from their big IP, like God of War or The Last of Us or Uncharted or whatever. A lot of times it's stuff like Helldivers 2, which sold really well, but come on, man. Like, to me, that's not a first-party PlayStation game. That anybody could have published that. So anyway, I'm very disappointed in this generation so far. And I think it has hurt not just the bottom line of a lot of publishers. I mean, that's why there's a lot of layoffs, because they're making games people don't want to buy. So I think this generation has been a disappointment. Is it too late to fix it at this point? You didn't ask that, but I'll just kind of ask myself that. I do feel like maybe over the next couple years, developers at that point should be up to speed creating games for Series X and PlayStation 5, and I would hope at least that games would start coming out at least a little bit more frequently once that happens. So do I have some late generation hope that things could turn around? A little bit. Next up, we have a question from El Timbo. Lord Shane, I'm going to keep this one simple. Dead Space 3 or the Callisto Protocol? Okay, so you may be wondering why El Timbo chose these two games to compare to each other. It is a little late. Callisto Protocol came out quite a while ago, but it's an interesting question because that's kind of like where the team went. The Dead Space team went for Dead Space 3, and then kind of the next game, the spiritual successor to Dead Space 3, was Callisto Protocol. Now, if you remember, we talked about Callisto Protocol on Game Face. Both Matt and I were pretty disappointed in it. Game looked good, but didn't play especially well, and the story was just kind of eh. Now, Dead Space 3, I think a lot of people have forgotten about it because the game is now 11 years old, so that's understandable. Dead Space 3 was a mixed bag. It has this really negative reputation, but I don't think the game is quite as bad as people perceive it to be. I think what happened was the standard was way up here with the first Dead Space, and to a lesser extent the second Dead Space, and then Dead Space 3 just went down here. And I think that's why people have this negative opinion of it, but it's not a terrible game. And honestly, it is way better than the Callisto Protocol. Just cut to the chase right there. There are so many elements in Dead Space 3 that do not make an appearance in the Callisto Protocol. And listen, I understand the argument of feature bloat, and that can happen a lot of times when you're working with a single franchise and you're on like the third iteration. You keep building on what was already there. By the time you get to the third or the fourth one, it can be dangerous to just bloat your game. And I do think there's a little bit of that in Dead Space 3, but I think that there's nowhere near any bloat in the Callisto Protocol. So you have like these games on two extremes. You have one that has like not enough, and you have one that probably has too much. I think if you meet in the middle, I think you're going to find that Dead Space 3 is the better game. If you've forgotten about Dead Space 3, the story is kind of lame. It's not quite as scary as the first two games. It's more of like a straight up like action game, and it did lose a little bit of its survival horror elements along the way. Don't forget, like in that game, maybe halfway into it, you end up going to an ice planet. And to me, that just kind of killed the whole idea behind Dead Space of these creatures like lurking in the shadows that you can't see. Instead, they're just like popping up out of the snow. I don't know what they were thinking with Dead Space 3, but it's still not as bad as the Callisto Protocol. It had a bunch of other stuff, like it had these zero-G elements where you had to navigate your oxygen levels. It had cooperative play. It had weapon crafting. Later on in the game, you start fighting humans instead of just fighting the necromorphs. There's a lot of variety and content in Dead Space 3, and you start talking about Callisto Protocol, and the story may be slightly better than what you're getting in Dead Space 3, but pretty much everything else other than the visuals are not up to scratch with Dead Space 3. The combat in Callisto Protocol is terrible. It is objectively terrible. I understand they tried to make it kind of loosey-goosey to make it feel like you were fighting for your life. All it felt like to me was it was unresponsive, and I was dying over things I shouldn't be dying over. So the moment-to-moment play of Callisto Protocol never really resonated with me, where, as with Dead Space 3, it still had, like, the mining tools and cutting limbs off of the enemies and making them crawl towards you. Like, it still had all the cool gameplay elements that are unique to Dead Space, but the problem was it just kept going and adding stuff on top of it. So if I had to choose between the two, for me it's easy. It's Dead Space 3, and I do think a lot of you think the game is way worse than it really is. Okay, our last question for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything comes from Khalib Twalai. In your professional opinion, what is a AA game? This question is also coming from the talk that Sean Layden gave at Gamescom Asia. He also mentioned that the industry has kind of lost that AA game, and that's what the industry needs to fill the potholes between all the big releases, and that without AA games, the industry is going to die. Those quotes resonated throughout the industry, and I'm guessing that's why Khalib Twalai has asked me about it. So here's what I say. It all comes down to money spent in development. Now, I know Matt will always say, like, to me, an indie game is just a game that's where the developer is independent, meaning that technically they're not aligned with the publisher or whatever. Most people look at indie games as smaller 2D games. Let's just be honest. That's the way most people look at it. And those games are generally developed for, you know, a good one, $5 million, but probably on average $2.5 million. Then you get to AA. AA is anything more expensive than that. So I would say anything from like $5 million to develop to like $25 million to develop. Maybe even more, actually. AA probably goes up to like around 30 or 40 million. And then anything over that is what you would call AAA, or what I like to call big budget. So I do think it's as simple as that. It's just really a factor of how much money is spent on development. Once you get over 5 million, that's when you get it into the AA space. And I would also take umbrage with what Sean Layden said. He basically said that the AA game is going away or disappearing. I disagree with that. I think there are maybe less than there used to be, but there are less games, period, than there used to be, except for indie. That number just seems to keep going up astronomically. I don't know who they think they're going to sell all these games to, because I think they're finding out that there aren't enough people to buy all these indie games. But we just watched the Xbox Partner Showcase for October 2024, and literally the entire presentation was AA games, one after another. I don't even think there was an indie game in there, actually, now that I think about it. Maybe one, but no, that whole thing was AA games with a development budget of $5 to like $30 or $40 million. Stepping aside from just the cost of development, what else do I think makes a AA game? I think one thing I would say that pretty consistently delineates an indie game from a AA game is 3D polygonal visuals. Now, of course, there are indie games that only cost $1 million or $5 million to develop that use polygonal graphics, polygons to build their 3D visuals, but there aren't many. And definitely the ones that do have it are on the higher end of the indie scale. So I do think that's kind of a dividing line. Is your game a 2D game, or is your game a 3D game? Because once you make a 3D game, that opens up a whole new can of worms and a whole new opportunity to spend money during development. So again, I feel like I'm getting back to the money part of it, but let's talk about the creative part of it. So polygonal visuals is a big part of it. The other big part of it is you're going to cut down on cinematics and stuff like that. So one of the things that AA games borrow from indie games to try to save costs is, instead of animating big cinematics with crazy over-the-top set-piece moments and voice acting and facial animation and all that kind of stuff that you get in the big AAA games, what AA games do that they borrow from indie games is when they go to tell the story, the game will either go to static screens of the player faces and they'll just run voice acting, or they will go to a screen where there's like a cartoon version of their head there and it will just be text across the screen. That's one of the things that delineates AA. Another thing that delineates AA is generally the length of the game. It's hard to think of too many AA games that are over like 10 or 15 hours long. Now, there is a developer called Spiders that Matt and I champion all the time. They make these huge open world action RPGs that are absolutely AA, and those games are like 50 hours long, but they are the exception to the rule. Typically AA games are a little bit shorter and they don't go as deep. So let's say in a AAA game, you have a skill tree that has like 5 branches and there's like 10 things in each branch for like 50 total upgrades. Generally in a AA game, you may have like 3 branches with like 6 or 7 options. So you have like 20 or 30 abilities that you can upgrade to. They basically call or chop down pretty much every element of the game so they don't have to create as much. The same holds true with voice acting and all the other stuff. They simply don't have to pay as much because they're not bringing in the voice actors to work on the game as long as they would in a AAA game. So once again, it's somehow come back to the budget of game development, but that just sort of backs up my whole idea, which is that's generally how you can delineate between indie, AA, and AAA. Okay, that's it for this short edition of Ask Shane Anything. Again, you guys gotta ask questions. This is a Q&A show. If I'm not getting questions, I can't do the show. And I love doing this show. And I don't want to skip weeks because we don't have questions. So again, go to sifted.net. Up in the header, there's a link to go to our forums to ask me questions. Again, you can ask me about anything. It doesn't have to be about games. The sky's the limit. Even after 120 episodes, the sky is still the limit. So head on over there, ask me questions. I just want to take a second to say thank you. If you are pledging at the Ask Shane tier at patreon.com/sifted. If you pledge at that tier, you're going to guarantee that this show keeps going as long as you keep asking questions. Now, everybody gets to ask questions, though I give favor to those who are pledging at the higher tier. Everybody gets to watch the archive. We're going to make sure everybody gets to watch it. But we do this show because a lot of you guys are pledging at that higher tier. So thank you very much. Have yourselves a great week, and I'll see you next Thursday.